Welcome to Now and Next in Public Affairs, brought to you by Helio Intelligence, the home of de Havilland and Forefront. I'm Jack Tolbert and I'm in Brussels. It's really good to be here. The sun is shining and we're in early September. And today I'm really happy to be joined by Christiaan Smits, who is the Head of Public Policy Europe for Cloudfare. Christiaan, Thank you for joining.
Nice to be here, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Let's get into the meat and drink of this podcast. Let's talk about the future of public affairs here in Brussels. You've obviously got a lot of experience. We're talking over 25 years in the Brussels arena. You've worked at big law firm Freshfields. You've obviously working for a US firm now. Can you talk me through how your experiences evolved?
Yeah, well, with pleasure, of course. So when I started 25 years ago, it was actually quite difficult to get into this job, but I'd set out to do this. I thought this is going to be fun. It fits my personality. I think that's been a good estimation. But how do you get in there, right? How do you find that first job? And I was lucky, I suppose. I found a few internships back in The Hague. I'm Dutch. But then quite quickly, after a year and a half, I was able to make a move to Brussels. I've been here ever since. And I've always been in advocacy. I've always been in public affairs. So you'll find a lot of people who do this, who started in the European Parliament or in the European Commission or in a company or organization in another role, but then moved into public affairs. I've always done it as such, which means that I think, it's true that I have spent 25 years looking at this profession change quite profoundly, and there's been quite a few seminal changes over the last 25 years. Back in the day, so this is 2000, 2001, when I first came here, it was much smaller and it was much slower. You didn't have the internet the way we have it now, of course. You couldn't find a lot of things being published online. There weren't online consultations. There was certainly no web streaming of committee meetings of the European Parliament or of the Council when the ministers meet, because you stream that as well, right, these days. All of that, you actually had to travel to Brussels to meet people, to see what happened live. And it might even happen that you would go to Brussels because you had the agenda of maybe the Economic Committee of the European Parliament. Then you arrive and you find out they've changed the agenda and your point happened yesterday or happens tomorrow. So actually the logistics was much more cumbersome as well than it is these days. And the people that did it, well, they didn't have any background in it. They hadn't studied public affairs at university or done anything like that. They kind of stumbled into it, and I suppose most of them enjoyed it and just sort of professionalized with the job along the way. Nowadays, you can actually find universities where you can study public affairs as part of maybe politics or on its own, or as part of communications-based skills. And myself as well, I did quite a bit of guest lecturing at various universities, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when this became much more of a profession that you can choose to do when you come out of university. So one thing I would say is over 25 years, I've really seen it professionalize. It used to be a thing that people did because there was a need for it. There was a need for communicating in the way one does to influence, hopefully, developments here in Brussels and the European Union. But there wasn't really any thought yet to how do you structure this? Should there be bodies representing lobbyists? How does a career get shaped in this profession as well? You kind of had to start going. At the time I started, I was in my mid-20s, I suppose. You don't know anybody. You kind of feel your way around it. It was a union of 15 countries. Now we're 27. That in itself makes a difference, of course, because the big countries, back in the day, also the UK, but certainly France and Germany, were very, very important, maybe more so than they are now, because there are plenty of other countries to take into account that are also in the mix. A system of 27 countries is by nature more complicated, and you can find different blocks of influence as well. The Eastern European countries come to mind, for instance. So there's one big difference, of course. Then the other thing that I've seen over the years was an acceptance of public affairs. The word lobbying in some countries is still a bit of a charged term. It's seen as a dodgy exercise. Myself, I've always thought if someone does public affairs with integrity, takes it very seriously, and is very professional about it, then that is not dodgy at all. There is nothing to be ashamed of, and it should be welcomed, because if it's done properly, what it does is it makes the policy process in Brussels much more transparent. And it helps involve different stakeholders, different parties with legitimate interests in the decision making. And I think if you talk to a lot of people in the European Commission, for instance, they will recognize that, and they have organized around it as well, which is why you see many more public consultations these days. They organize a lot of stakeholder roundtables to make sure that everybody gets a say. It's not really just the European Parliament, the member states in the Council, upon a proposal from the European Commission, that's it. No, and it never was. There's always going to be people around it who want to influence the proceedings. And as I said, if they have legitimate interest and if they do that in a professional way, that is to be welcomed. That's always been my conviction. So about that point of acceptance of public affairs, I think there's much more of a recognition of that. There are many more agencies, consultancies out there now that help. At the time, it was probably actually mostly the Brits who were quite professional about this. I think even 25 years ago, in a place like London, there was already quite a lot of public affairs. Not so much in Paris, not so much in Berlin, certainly not so much in Rome. There, this was all in its infancy. Nowadays, actually, the French have become quite good at public affairs. And there's a whole new generation of young French people, giving this as an example, who come to Brussels, who are very fluent in English, which, by the way, they weren't 25 years ago either, and who go about influencing very professionally. Same for the Germans. So you see that evolve as well, this acceptance of public affairs. And I think a lot of organizations have set up teams, hired people who do this on their behalf in Brussels, either on a part-time basis, maybe traveling in and out, or full-time. So it's grown, which means that there's many more people doing this now as well. And you see these estimates in the media. Sometimes usually they want to make it look like there's something dodgy going on. There are 50,000 people doing this, and we're all very much in the shadows. That's of course nonsense. I would say if you wanted to have an estimate of the people that are seriously doing public affairs in Brussels, you could, for instance, look at the registry for the European Parliament. I would say most serious public affairs professionals would have an access badge to the European Parliament. You could count that. You'd have somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people, I would think, that genuinely dedicated themselves to professionally being in public affairs. So it's grown, it's professionalized, and it's much more accepted now than it was back in the day. Then the way it's done. This has changed in multiple ways. There's much more of a recognition these days that, and of course, any good lobbyist will be able to tell you, a lot of policy in Brussels is not made in Brussels. It's actually developed in the capitals, because in the Council of Ministers, the member states have a really very important say. Not because just they're sending people to these council working groups where all that stuff gets discussed that actually know their stuff. They're sending specialists. But also they are the ones who have to implement European legislation. And that sets them a little apart from the European Parliament, where you find significant turnover of MEPs. I think the last time around it was 60% of the members of the European Parliament were new to Brussels, which means that they would have to get versed into the system. It takes a while before you become effective. It probably takes more than a 5-year term in the European Parliament before you become a really effective MEP as well. So that's always changed the way you have to talk to the different institutions. So I've seen a shift towards the Council, and that means a shift towards activities in the member states as well. And then, of course, there was Brexit, which is 7-8 years ago, Jack? You're a Brit?
Yes, it was 9 years ago.
9 years ago, there you go, yeah. Well, I've lived it. I was in a British law firm. I spent a lot of time in London explaining to people what would happen if the Brits would exit. And it has profoundly changed the dynamics here as well. And then COVID came along. We had a European Parliament where, as I said, the majority of people were new. And I think within a year, we all went into lockdown. So there was a whole body of people there who were not used to public affairs professionals on their doorstep, communicating with them, explaining to them what they wanted to explain, working with them perhaps on changes to legislation or explaining interests and viewpoints. And that lasted years. And by the time we came out of the lockdowns, the large part of that 5-year term was behind us. So there was a whole parliamentary term, a whole 5-year period during which there was very little interaction, in-person interaction for sure, in the European Parliament. And I think a lot of people there, they just never got into the flow of having a lot of interactions with lobbyists in Brussels. Where are we now with that? Well, one thing obviously that COVID propagated was video conferencing. And that's definitely one thing I want to mention now. A lot of what we do has gone online. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who told you this. And that has had a few effects in itself, good ones and bad ones. On the upside, you have to imagine at the time, for instance, I had clients that were US companies and they wanted to influence things in Brussels. How would that go? You would plan at least a month ahead for someone to fly in from maybe Washington, D.C. or Austin, Texas or San Francisco. Then you would set up a program with maybe various DGs, Directorates General in the European Commission, a bunch of MEPs, other stakeholders, and they would spend 2-3 days in Brussels. Super stressful. A lot of logistics, a lot of work went into that. And then you would really hope that people wouldn't be canceling meetings on you because you had an American, at the airport. That's all changed, of course. You don't have to fly in anymore, which means that you can do many more meetings in much less time, with much less lead time as well. If now my bosses in the US want to meet with DG Connect, then we typically have a meeting within a week. If they want to talk to us about a topic that they care about, even shorter than that. So that speed has gone up. That's actually quite good. The downside is, what does that look like? Video calls have a very different dynamic to when you're sitting at a table like you and me now, Jack, and interacting. There is hardly any nonverbal communication. It's limited to maybe 30 minutes or it's limited to a full hour. There's no handshake, there's no coffee, no nothing. And what does that mean? I think it doesn't give you the same depth of communication. And I don't think it creates the same personal relationship. And by consequence, and that's really my conclusion, it doesn't create the same level of trust either. And trust is very, very fundamental to what we do in public affairs. I've said this on many occasions, but I think ultimately it is our currency. And it's built over time, and you can lose it just like that, which goes back to my original point around having to be professional, integrity, all those things. You have to build that up. But personal contact is also very fundamental to trust. And that's how you gain influence. If people trust you, then they will listen to you. I'm not convinced that video calls are a one-on-one replacement for personal meetings. At the same time, we do so many of them these days, and it's so easy that we maybe quantity and quality find a balance there somewhere. We have so many more video calls that ultimately we end up having a similar level of influence, but I kind of miss it as well. It was also part of the fun, right? And if you're a people person, I am, then it's rather nice to walk in there and be able to strike up a personal relationship with maybe a member of the European Parliament who's going to stick around for the next few years. And you can do some really good work with them over time. You can have honest conversations. They also open up to you. You don't get that when you're doing video calls the way we do these days. So it's really changed the way we go about communicating. And I'm not sure it's all been good, but certainly it's made Brussels more accessible, I think, to many people who might not have the means to travel in as often. So that's probably one positive. So there you go. That's just a sort of a bird's flight through what I've seen over the last 25 years.
That's really good, Christiaan. Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to tech and hybrid working because we are going to talk about AI in a few moments. You've given quite a logical and very timely indication of how things have changed over the years, which is really good, with obviously with some pivotal moments in there, including COVID and Brexit. For the listeners, when I joined de Havilland in 2018, I remember my first trip to Brussels. I came and booked loads of meetings with clients and went with agendas and so on and so forth. And I would say 50% of my meetings, the agenda went out the window because people in Brussels just wanted for me to try and talk them through everything to do with Brexit, mainly why it happened. And I was, and to a certain extent, still remain quite confused about the whole thing. So yeah, some interesting memories. And particularly when it comes to COVID, we saw this both in the UK and especially with Brussels. The profession we work in is very much, as you've articulated, people to people. People person is the phrase that comes about. And then shifting everything to online for not just 3 weeks a month, a quarter, it was years and years. And there's obviously been some good things, and there's obviously been some not so good things that have come out of that. So it's a really, really interesting oversight that you've given, which I really, really appreciate. If we talk about tech and AI, as I say, you've articulated quite well the benefits of speed that's come with the increased use of technology. You've also talked about the things you don't necessarily get if you're not doing it face to face. There's all sorts of implications for use of technology. When it comes to AI and public affairs, and specifically public affairs in Brussels, what kind of impact do you think that's going to have on things here?
Probably in a variety of ways, but the first thing that comes to mind does have a lot to do with what you guys do for business, Jack, and that is the monitoring side of it. Of course, nothing happens if you don't have good information about what's going on in the institutions in Brussels. And there are probably two sides to that anyway. To start off, there is quite a lot of information out there in the public domain, and I think the European Union, that is to say the European Commission for sure, but also the European Parliament specifically, are very transparent and try to be very transparent. Less so for the Council, I have to say. It always has been a bit problematic, and then individual countries all have their own traditions. Some of them are more transparent than others. I say that because the value of whatever an AI system might pick up in terms of monitoring depends on what sort of data goes in there. So it's a very important question to ask yourself, what sort of information is out there that might not be easily accessible or easily findable for someone who isn't well versed in the systems, who doesn't know what to look for or where to look for that. But that's something AI can do. And the other bit of information that you need to have to be doing a good job in public affairs may not be available on the internet. It might be the insight that you gain from a conversation with an assistant in the European Parliament or an attaché in the Council representing a certain member state. It might be the sort of stuff that you learn in a meeting of your trade association, or if you meet with an NGO that agrees with you on your interests, they might have other insights. It might be a deeper insight into why a particular country took a particular position, for which you would have to find information in another language. Mind you, we have 20 plus languages in the European Union. It's not all English, right? Or it's not all French. So that's actually the other side of information that's quite interesting to ask yourself questions around when you want to talk about AI. Now, on that first bit, a lot of people started their careers in public affairs doing a lot of monitoring, collecting information, analyzing it perhaps, or presenting it in a digestible manner to the people that they worked for, the people that they represented, being their organization, customers, clients. That bit can easily be automated, and I think is already being automated to a certain degree, which means that for those who come straight out of university, want to do something with the European Union, need that entry-level job or even that internship to get started, to learn the ropes, those jobs, they may disappear quite quickly. So there is a question for younger people how to get into this kind of career. And I'll get to that in a second. I think there is still, however, that important other factor, the human factor, you might call it, and the information derived from the human factor, which I don't think is so easily automatable, because quite simply that information isn't just out there. That's important as well. So when it comes to monitoring, I think, there will be commoditization, there will be automation, there will be an important role for AI in there. That probably makes it cheaper and more accessible. Mind you, though, there is a challenge there because there is also disinformation out there as well. This is vulnerable. So how are we going to make sure that the information that is generated for organizations with a legitimate interest is actually correct? It's quite easy to put the wrong stuff out there, right? And AI systems, LLMs, make mistakes. They have hallucinations. You can manipulate that, currently at least. So that's an important one, I think, to bear in mind for anybody using AI for monitoring. But then you'll still have to overlay that if you want to do a really good job, if you want to have real insight, if you want to have an edge on organizations that may have an interest in the same topics that you do, but might not be as focused on it. And that is very often obviously the case because people try to gain an edge by influencing things. Then you want to have that information that is not easily findable for an AI model. And how do you do that? Well, that's still that personal job, to be out there, to talk to people, to make an effort in really understanding and probably building personal relationships to do so. So I think there is still very much a role ultimately for people like us in public affairs to do this, but it will change, yeah.
Thank you. One of the things you've raised there about disinformation is something that I maybe haven't considered in as much detail as I could have done. Obviously, with the onset of AI and companies starting to embrace it. As you say, there's a realm of information that's out there that monitoring firms collate and then repackage for their own purposes. I think the disinformation thing is actually quite important, and something that I imagine with the way the world is going, we'll probably see more and more of it. And how do the systems, how do the language models pick up what is factual and what is disinformation, and how does that then feed through ultimately to your public affairs professional? It's a really interesting point.
Very true. I think so. I'm not enough of an expert to know how you fix that, but hopefully other people are thinking about that already. And I think for all of us, and that's a point that we make internally at Cloudflare as well quite a lot, when you use AI, you should always bear in mind that you hold ultimate responsibility over the end product. You cannot just assume that what you get from your prompt is correct. You have to analyze it. And I frankly think for those of us who have ambitions in public affairs, you have to add that layer of your personal insight over it. So yes, it will help make a lot of the grunt work of monitoring more efficient. People will save time. You'll need fewer people to help you do that as an organization. But ultimately, I think it's that human factor that is not replicable, at least for the foreseeable future, that is still out there. The other thing I alluded to earlier is languages. We have 20 of them, I think, in the European Union. A lot of things still happen in those languages. You can't just rely on English or French or German. If you really wanted to build a good picture, you'd have to find ways into that as well. That can probably be done, but ultimately I think is also quite important to make sure that the right information goes in there, and that might not always be very obvious.
Yeah, really interesting and insightful point. And I think that my key takeaway is that the human insight remains as valuable, if not potentially more valuable, as we move into what will be the new world, and how that actually brings value to an internal organization.
You know, if I may,
yeah,
just to brainstorm a little bit about that. There is this thing I've observed over the last 2 decades in Brussels is, as I said, there's information out there that's easily accessible and findable for those who know where to look on websites of the European Parliament and the Commission. That's simple. But ask yourself, if you want to really influence something in the European Parliament, you don't just look at the amendments that MEPs have tabled to a Commission proposal that you can find on the website of a particular committee. Because those amendments go into compromise amendments. And those are published maybe an hour before the vote or even after the vote. But if you want to really influence that vote, you need to have those compromise amendments, right? Now, if you then look at the Council does have public documents out there, and there are non-papers and discussion papers and Commission analyses. There's also quite a lot of papers out there that they don't publish. And then they go to these negotiations between the different institutions about the final text. They're called trilogue negotiations. And for that, there is always a document with 4 tables. It has the position of the Parliament, the position of the Commission, the position of the member states in the Council, and then some column where the compromises are going to be. Now, that document isn't published. In my previous job at Freshfields, there was a lawyer who did quite a lot of pro bono work on transparency, on forcing European institutions to be transparent with their documents. And there are court cases in front of the European Court of Justice about trilogues especially, and what sort of documents need to be out there. And you will see the institutions pushing back. Why is that? Why did I give these 3 examples? Because quite a lot of the really interesting information is in documents that are not published. And those documents will also not be picked up by your AI application. See what I mean? So that's something that's not going to go away. And to get those documents, to have that kind of insight, to be able to share that and analyze that and influence that, ultimately, you need people. And I don't see that changing. So we have to be agile and embrace technology. I'm all for that. Absolutely true. But ultimately, that personal bit, that's not going to go away.
I tend to agree, which is probably good, which is because we're sat in the same room having a discussion about it. But before we move on to a couple of questions to finish, when it comes to what Brussels is going to look like, when it comes to what public affairs is going to look like, do you have any thoughts on how the landscape's going to evolve over the next 1, 2, 5 years?
I think one development is very much geopolitics. I think it's on everybody's mind. Europe is faced with a number of very significant challenges. We all know this. It's easy to just talk about the Trump government and the fact that we may have been over-reliant, or are in certain aspects over-reliant on the US. Those are not new themes. The previous European Commission, well before the second Trump administration, was also thinking about these things. Then there is the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, real challenges around how Europe presents itself globally, which also feeds into, of course, trade. How do we interrelate with China? Where is China going to be on the world stage anyway? Is it a West versus East struggle, or is it something even bigger than that? And then Europe has its own internal issues as well. There are far-right governments in a number of member states, and they are very skeptical of the European Union. And Europe is going to need an answer to that. The European Union is going to need an answer to that. And I don't think that's an easy answer. But we talked previously about Commission's desire to be transparent in what it does. I think that is only more important to communicate, to explain what we do here and why we do this. At the same time, I don't have the latest figures, but you see these polls out there. I think support for the European Union has gone up. I think a lot of citizens feel it is important that we are strong and that we are stronger together. So there's a big job to be done to grow that trust with electorates in the 27 countries and probably a few countries around it as well, including yours, Jack. You see even smaller countries like Liechtenstein cozying up. Switzerland is probably asking itself quite a few questions after they failed to do a good deal with the Americans. So Europe is actually becoming more important. Defense itself is a fascinating field. None of us probably in the mainstream thought about it an awful lot. Nowadays we're trying to build an industry. We're spending huge amounts of public money on that. But also you see, when European leaders went to Washington 2 weeks ago, they go there with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. So you see this sort of convergence even of acting together at the world stage of NATO and the European Union, even though there's no structural or legal way that they do that. So those are really fascinating developments that will change the landscape. But I only see Europe becoming more important, not less important. And I only see a need to communicate even better about what we do than we did before. And for that, I frankly do feel that public affairs professionals have an important role in making transparent what happens here, not just in Brussels, but back in the countries of the organizations that they represent. And let's have a fair debate. Let's bring it all out in the open. Why are we doing this? And how are we going to work together even better to further our position in the world, but also the economic well-being of the citizens?
Some very thought-provoking things in there, which I will definitely have a reflection on. We're somewhat limited by time because I feel like me and you could probably talk about a number of those things for considerably longer than we have today. Yes. But a couple of lighter questions to finish, if that's okay. The first question is, what would be your single non-negotiable piece of advice that you might share with someone who is starting out in public affairs in Brussels?
Stay yourself. I think to be convincing, and a big part of the job in public affairs is to convince other people, you have to be authentic. And people pick up on that. So don't try to be someone you're not, and stay very close to your own skill set. And for some people, this might be that they're really good at analyzing. For other people, this might be that they're really good at detail. Other people might just be really good at communicating and have a lot of empathy. It doesn't really matter. I've seen lobbyists, hundreds of them over the years, very, very effective people who did their jobs in many, many different ways. There is not one very good way to do this. There are many different ways of doing a proper job.
Second question is, there's a lot of events in Brussels, particularly networking events. What would you say is the best one you've been to over the years?
That is a very good question, actually. I think there's a couple of very good conferences out there that happen every year, and every industry has them. I think per industry, let's say I work in tech now, right? There are probably 2 or 3 of those out there. For finance, there are probably 2 or 3 out there. Make sure that you know for your topic, what are the 2 or 3 big conferences. Make sure you go there. Ideally speak there, or have someone speak there on a panel. So that's one thing. And then for those of us who start out, when I started, there was no such thing as Place du Luxembourg, or Place Lux as it's called. This has developed over the time, but by all means, be out there, meet lots of people, make lots of friends. I think it will only enrich you, and you'll see over time the people that you meet early on, they all will have their own careers, and they will come on your path as well and probably share their insights with you along the way, and you'll grow together. The people that I got to know 20, 25 years ago, they're all still around, or a lot of them are still around. also in the member states, right? But if you stay in touch, you'll see that you'll still have lots of relevant conversations because they all cared about the same thing. We all enjoy this thing that we do here in Brussels.
Absolutely. Third question is, do you have a favorite MEP?
I don't. I had quite a few favorite MEPs, but they've left since, and there were quite a few Brits actually on my favorites list at the time. The Brits were always very effective in the European Parliament, so I wouldn't be able to choose one right now. And actually, they've really only been doing this for a year, right? So the word is still out on who's going to emerge as my favorite over the next 4 years.
Yeah, perhaps we'll catch up on that in a few years' time. And then final question. We hear a lot of interesting stories about plenary sessions. Do you have any plenary session moments that stick with you or that you'll never forget?
Yes. Strasbourg especially, right? Although more and more plenary sessions are held in Brussels these days. I think there was one, this is a very long time ago, but there was a vote on, it was a piece of legislation. It had to do with corporate governance. I think it was maybe the takeover directive or something like that. And this is probably 20 years ago, where the Commission lost a vote, or Bolkestein at the time, a Dutch politician. He was head of the internal market at the time. He lost it by 1 or 2 votes. And the drama, I was in the room. The drama was just palpable. It was really, and the MEPs love that, right? They love a show because they're MEPs, they're politicians. So at the time, it was just fascinating to see that there are those moments where you can lose a vote by 1 or 2 MEPs not showing up or pushing the wrong button. Even I've seen that too. So these things happen.
Pushing the wrong button. That is.
That does happen.
I don't quite know what to say on that. But Christiaan, thank you so much for coming in and joining me on today's episode. We've covered a lot. We could talk about it for a lot longer, but I really appreciate you coming in. It's been brilliant. So thank you very much. My thanks to Ollie Foster, as always, who's our in-house producer. Perhaps you have a view on the future of public affairs here in Brussels and you'd like to share your opinions or you'd like to add to the discussion yourself. Please follow the link in the show's bio, which will direct you to our feedback page for Helio Intelligence, which is the home of de Havilland and Forefront.